out. This is for real deal. Min Choi set us up. Hey, everybody. How are y'all? I can't hear. Can you, Min?
Let's see. Can anyone speak?
Hello.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, no one was talking. That's why you couldn't hear anything.
Everyone was stunned by our setup. Look at this. And Marianne Voigt. Look at Marianne. Oh, hey. How's sunny Florida? Oh, I can't hear Marianne, though. Can anyone else?
Marianne is currently muted. There you go.
Okay. There you go.
It's pretty hot still down here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this is an experiment. You're part of an experiment here, a laboratory of ideas for catechism this week. And Min, along with Taylor and I, are sort of set up in this podcast vibe. So we're going to capture it, record it here, and then Min will release it as a podcast as well in the aftermath. But the plan will be to run in our usual fashion, where we'll cover some ideas, 25 to 30 minutes, and then have Q&A back and forth, usually verbally. But if you want to try the chat box this time, you're welcome to do that. We'll give folks a couple more minutes to come in. How's the sound? All that seems like it's good. It's working. Sweet. Great. We'll do our 4 or 5 minute delay as is our custom. Yeah. Go back to 5G. Okay, go for it. We're going to experiment with internet real quick. Hang on.
Are you paying August for on-hand tech support, or is this a role?
Yeah. If you lose us for a sec, it's all right. Do you think the 5G or the 2.4G is better?
It's just from the computer.
That's the stuff, the computer right there. Hey, Og, did you switch it? Okay, you're going to go check up there. Awesome. Gary, how's it going?
Oh, pretty good. Pretty good.
Can you?
Welcome to my studio.
Now we're frozen. See if it comes
I'm hearing
back.
them. Yeah.
Are we frozen? How's it going?
I think we see you just fine. I'm hearing you.
You can see us, Taylor. Awesome.
We've also got a behind the scenes view if anyone's wondering what this studio looks like.
I feel like this is worse than before.
Is it? Okay.
Og, what do you think? You think I think we should go back to the hotspot. We should just do it now because I want to get rolling. Here, I'll give you, I'll try it one more time. I'll give you permission. Yeah, just use mine.
Is that my tea over there?
Yeah, that's
Taylor,
it.
could you be able to look at that for me? Thank you.
Snack thing there.
Thank you, friend.
Do you need me to give you the privilege jog? Grumman's. Okay. We're back on hotspot. Is Min, do you have unlimited? You're good. We're not going to stop you. No,
It's okay.
it's okay.
Thank you. Actually,
You want to go to mine?
yeah, let's do
Yes,
that.
go to mine. Sorry. Hang on one second.
Okay, I'm on.
You're on. Okay, perfect.
Ooh,
Snack time.
snacks.
Okay.
I think that this will be good. It's unusual, but
Yeah, at night it gets a little dicey. Okay. I think we struggled through some technical difficulties and we're live. We should all follow Gary's lead and do some stretching to get into our catechetical mood. You lead us in the evening stretch, Gary. It's awesome.
I'm preparing for
That's
a
what
long
painters
evening.
do. Yeah, exactly. It's going to be long. It's going to be brutal. Hey, welcome everybody. It's so good to see you. This is fun. We're doing catechism by Zoom so that we can include lots of different people. Can't make the live thing, and also doing a new thing with a co-host with Min Choi.
Hello. This is fun.
This is fun. And so all the gadgets and gizmos are just to help record it so that when we release it later as a podcast or whatever, it's in best shape that it can be. But we continue in the spirit of catechism at Church of the Vine, which is really adult Christian education in the season, thinking about things related to culture, kingdom citizenship, and this unique season that we're all in as the church. And so tonight we'll follow our form of having some reflections at the beginning and then Q&A back and forth. So feel free to hit us up after we get through some material. So this again is Church of the Vine's Catechism podcast. Working title. Don't have anything snappy quite yet, but we hope to. And I'm Joseph Clare, co-host here with Min Choi.
Hello.
Hello. And it's October 21, 2020, election season. This is season 1, episode 1 for us. And really the idea here is to follow the spirit of ancient catechism, which is instruction in the Christian faith, instruction with an eye toward application and contemporary culture and faith rubber meeting the road. And so tonight we continue in that theme of kingdom citizenship, what it means to be Christians who are citizens of earthly cities, but also heavenly in our outlook and end game. So tonight, faith and politics really is what it boils down to. So the simple starting question, and we'll kind of go around the room, starting with you, Min, is tell everybody who you're going to vote for president, if you would. I know the ballot has been sitting on your kitchen counter for a while, so you've had time, right?
I can't think of a better way to start a brand new podcast to garner new viewers,
Yeah.
trust between the audience and you. I think in the intro video that we sent out, in my mind, I thought the ballot envelope was like 5 inches thick. That's how I'm feeling about it. Lots of weight in that envelope. But I looked at it today again, and it felt like more like a college rejection letter size envelope rather than one that says you're accepted. So there must be something going in my mind when it comes to this idea, this daunting idea of how do I ultimately navigate, going into November and who do I vote for and things like that. So I'm not going to answer your question. And
yeah, exactly.
I think you're joking a little bit, but it's very important.
I was going to see if you would bite. That actually would have been a great way to, but I think it brings up the question for me is why wouldn't you like crisply, surely, certainly spit out an answer? Why would it feel like I asked you the most shameful, dirty family secret that you wouldn't dare speak even in, in a room of a few friends or Zoom screen with church congregants? Where are we politically? Is it unique to this historical moment? Or does that say something about the tension between our Christian faith and politics? I think that's what we need to dig into a little bit tonight. One way to do it would be to simply reflect on the kind of scriptural, historical, theological backbone. You know, I like to do that. Try not to bore everybody out there to tears, but to ask what the church or what Christian faith's relationship to political life, that special domain or realm of our lives that is shared publicly with the state, with the country, with the nation, different iterations through time. But I actually think it's a very uncomfortable, tense relationship that Christians have. It's a confusing relationship with the political community, and for good reason. Actually, I think the New Testament sort of sets us on that trajectory. You know, recently we heard in the lectionary that gospel reading where Jesus says, "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's." That leaves us in this kind of uncertain state of saying, there's part of our lives that is solely for God, and there's a part of our lives that is maybe for the state, for the political community. And there's like, is that like a division? Does it introduce like this kind of split duality? I don't know. How have you thought about that, Min?
Yeah, I mean, it goes, for me, it goes into the question of like, what does it mean to be faithful? You know, how do you set the right priorities? How do we even navigate complex issues? Because at the heart of politics, I would say, is a way to talk about how to best live, right? And we know, especially in our context in 2020, that there are as many opinions about that as there are people. And so where do we find commonality? Where do we find compromise? Where do we find collaboration? I think it becomes really, really daunting. And sometimes it makes me feel either like I want to run away from it and not engage, or it makes me want to like dominate and try to like get my view to be, you know, to actualize it into reality in a unhealthy way.
Yeah, well, I think politics in our contemporary cultural moment has become a site like sports, an arena of competition where you can work out you can kind of thrash other people in a bloodless way and get away with it. And digital social life, you know, sort of makes that even more feasible. I think part of what makes the question vexing and confusing is that the church has had lots of different iterations of the relationship between Christian faith or Christian community and the political society. So I think broadly, historically, I love historical theology. You could think of three key phases that the church has had in its relationship to the political. Phase A, basically from 0 to 500, is this relationship of outright tension or conflict, almost, where the church is the minority. Jesus preaches of a kingdom which is not of this world. He is Lord. He's Kyrios. Early Christians are a threat to the empire. They're persecuted minority. They're martyrs. It's kind of clear that heavenly citizenship means something else, something other. From the time of the conversion of Constantine in the 300s, and then slowly building with the fall of the Roman Empire, Christianity gets synthesized with the Roman Empire. I mean, it kind of crescendos. You hear Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne and Christendom, this idea where the Pope and the Emperor have kind of like come to terms with each other. And there's this merge of church and state. It's obviously complex, super complicated picture. But since the Reformation, so that's maybe 500 to 1500, from the Reformation till now, it's been the slow separation of church and state, where we've kind of gone back to the render unto Caesar model and said there's parts of our lives that are political, they're public, they're shared, they might even be pluralistic, they're in common, they're governed by reason, material needs, and there's parts of our lives that are spiritual, they're governed by God, and that's translated through the church. And so, of course, America is very much in that 18th century vision of church and state having a separation. But that leads to the American experiment, which is fundamental constitutional separation of religion and politics, or church and state. And yet Christian values and Christian life and Christian views of the world are like totally central to this understanding of democracy or democratic republic. So the other thing to think about is there's a tension between church and state because of Jesus's teachings, because of Paul's teachings on heavenly citizenship. there's these three historical phases, and there's other things going on in the global church, of course. But then there's different forms of government. And that's what I want to say as a roundabout answer to your question is every government, every form of institutional governance has an associated way of life that goes along. This is how you live in a monarchy. This is how you live in a democracy. This is how you live in an aristocracy. And so I think the thing that we've tried to do as Christians is to wrestle with the question, does the Bible recommend a certain form of government as like the best form of government? And some ways you want to say monarchy, right? Like, isn't King David like God's man, like God's son in some sense? Like that's the vision of Zion you get in the Psalms. And of course, there's that tension in 1 Samuel where God's not happy when they ask for a king. They want to be like the other nations, and God wanted to be their king. And there's a theocracy, but then there's like a monarchy that goes along with it. In some ways, that justifies Christendom in the sense of like fusion between church and state. And then there's the New Testament sort of sense that no, church and state, religion and politics, there's a distinction between the two realms. And America has been an experiment sort of premised on this idea that Christian understanding of the world, say a Christian understanding of a human being as being made in the image of God, the dignity that goes along with that, a Christian view of ethics or neighbor love, these are the impulse, the animating spirit that give rise to democracy as the best form of government that most adequately and accurately represents that view of the human person and that view of human relationships. Now that's part and parcel of like the fabric of the democratic project, and hence why you have, I think, in America now, this really strong, challenging sort of relationship between Christians and American. You kind of have a right and a left version. I just saw the Pew Research Forum put out today or this past week, the most recent polls. It was so fascinating that white Christians are still overwhelmingly saying that they'll vote for Trump, for example. So you have 72% of white evangelicals. And of course, it's a huge debate. What does an evangelical mean? 72% saying if they voted today, it would be Trump. 55% of white mainline Protestants, which seems potentially surprising. Mainline Protestants are traditionally a bit more liberal, social justice oriented. And then in white Catholics, same in the 50 percentile. So that's not to say anything about parties yet or otherwise, but it is to say that in the answer that people give as to why, they identify certain issues or policies that they feel are most representative of their deepest religious conviction. So we're in this kind of like dance of like, well, I'm an issues voter and these issues matter to me and I have views on them because of my Christian faith. And yet you see Christians, not just Christians in secular or religious or other religious people, but Christians themselves having very different views as to how you translate your faith into the issues that then determine how you vote. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Sorry for rambling.
No, it's good.
So that leaves us back to where we started. Who are you going to vote for, men? No, I think the answer to who you're going to vote for depends fundamentally on how you translate your Christian faith into your political views or the issues that you think are most decisive for how you're going to vote. And so I think the thing that I've been wrestling with is, are there like false ways in which we think our faith is informing our political views? Are there like things that appear to be the answer or the right form of translation, but they're actually like false answers or false hopes, if that makes sense?
I think so. I mean, when I think about this topic of how do we navigate politics and how do we even integrate our faith into that topic? Because, in some ways you can say politics kind of spills into everything, how we think, how we live, how we are in community and things like that. I think one thing I would say is universally a trap is thinking that there is only one way to approach a problem. And a byproduct of that is thinking that the problem is solvable through like a pat answer or just like one really black and white solution. And we often see a manifestation in that in our two-party system.
Yep.
You know, two parties that can't, it's like oil and water. They don't seem to agree on anything.
Yep.
And I think part of the lie that's built into that bipartisan system is it's either this way or that way,
Yep.
and not a plurality of ways that require deep thinking, lots of patience, and a lot of just like humility to approach it. So
Yep.
that's like one thing that I think can be a deception, thinking that you have to put all your eggs in kind of like this one basket, this one solution, or
Yep.
it won't work out, or it won't go right.
Yeah, and I think you want to distinguish between the false comfort of certainty that's not available,
Mm-hmm.
and like a healthy kind of discomforting confusion that is actually goading you toward the truth, the reality of what. It's not an invitation just to relativism, but it also is like a self-aware, self-critical humility that you need. So I would say one way in which I think Christians have been seduced by the two-party system in this moment is that we have right now Christians who think that their faith translates into political views or moral issues that are political parties, and that is almost like two forms of dueling civil religion, I'll call it. So civil religion traditionally is like that form of political faith where it's like translated into your political life and views. And so civil religion left is fundamentally about the biblical vision of care for the widow, the poor, and the orphan, and all of the social justice sort of elements related to that. Obviously, racial injustice is front and center, super important, a lot of truth to that view. Civil religion right is premised on this like recovery of the Christian fabric of this country, which of course has never been enshrined as the state religion, but it has been a big part of the formation of this country's outlook and perspective. And one of those issues that's so front and center is the sanctity of innocent human life, unborn life, abortion. It becomes the single issue for which you're willing to put all of your political eggs in that basket. And I think that the problem with the two-party solution and the dueling civil religions is that they each have an element of truth of the Christian vision of life, but they get opposed to each other, and they feed on that temptation. They feed on that desire to be polarized, to have an us and them, and to be able to be on a team and to want to trash the other team. It's really satisfying to beat the other team down. And so I guess the question is, why are we tempted by polarization? Like, what's the benefit to us to be polarized?
Yeah. You know, I always think about like, I feel like there's often this nefarious secret third party that's behind these two parties, and they're winning as long as there's continued strife. You know what I mean? As the system is like built on this idea of like, as long as they disagree, as long as they're vitriolic towards one another, that's the way the system has been designed.
Yep.
And this small little group over here is benefiting from that or something like that. That's how, I don't know, that's a weird way of thinking about it, but you know what I mean?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you're a very conspiratorial person. So that doesn't surprise me.
I like the spy movies.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that what's tempting about that, and why this like nefarious third group is behind us, the nefarious third group, now this is to get really conspiratorial, is Mark Zuckerberg or somebody's back there. Somebody is back there benefiting from our delight in polarization, because I think there's a temptation for ideological purity, right? Like everybody wants to, like, you want to sew the whole thing shut, not just like have the right beliefs and practices, but you want to know you're right, and you want to know you're on the right team. And that only heightens in an age of pluralism. And that's been that's a challenge of American democracy, is it's this idea of like reconciling the masses, the mob, and bringing us together for self-government, making us just virtuous enough that we don't trash each other and turn into mob rule. But that requires lots of different perspectives, lots of different outlooks. But that pluralism is unsettling, right? Like moral or spiritual pluralism. It's okay maybe if it's like you like to shop at, you know, Whole Foods and I go to New Seasons, that's fine. But I don't like it when you actually have a different view of some really important topic. So this temptation for ideological purity that I think, you know, again, technology, I think we're finding social media, it feeds, you get more hits for the outrageous thing that's really on the extreme side.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of advertising and marketing benefits for the way the stuff feeds around, right?
Yeah. I feel like in this line of thinking, ultimately, as a Christian, that seems, it can create like discouragement, because what do you do then?
Mm-hmm.
But then I think one of the more powerful passages in Acts is when Paul goes to Athens and surveys the culture and says, I have an answer. You have like this sign that says, to a God unknown. I'm here to tell you about that God. And I think he's battling philosophically at the marketplaces and the Areopagus. Yeah. And I think that's a really hopeful picture about how our faith can enter into the political arena, into the arena where there's differences of opinions, lots of vitriol, lots of challenges, and go toe to toe and give an answer that is unlike anything in the world. I would say, like a kingdom, perspective into some of these problems that we have. And that's where often I have to go to, or it leads me into this place of like, I'm just one voice of many, or I have one ideological viewpoint amongst many. How do I even create any sort of progress or movement because of that?
Yes. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Christian from almost the earliest phases adopted education and the liberal arts in particular, this idea of being a citizen, to have reasoned dialogue and spirited debate with other people who have totally different viewpoints. Like that's part of the democratic practice, the way of life. I mean, you go back to Athens where democracy was born. It was like the assembly was everything. The rhetoric was everything, the ability to persuade and to argue and to debate. And Christians, obviously the Bible has this sense of reasoning together in the community, but they adopted that. And I think the American experiment is premised on that we're better off when we constrain the tyrants in terms of government with democracy, but we also govern ourselves and participate and become a part of the way of this life. And I think the gospel, I think, Martin Luther King Jr., Jacques Maritain, Reinhold Niebuhr, there's all these really important figures after World War II in America who talk about Christianity and the way of Jesus is compatible with democracy, because the way of Jesus is fundamentally about the arts of humility, about listening, about paying attention to other people, encountering them as human beings, as persons. Like these are the things that are required for a democracy to be successful. So there's this kind of like secret compatibility that people start to suss out mid-century about a democratic way of life and governance. And the gospel, there's like a seed of democracy in the gospel, as Jacques Maritain says. The other thing I think, Min, is that one of the other temptations is not just polarization. So maybe you're not like an NFL football, like Democrat or versus Republican, like trash each other kind of person. Maybe your temptation is privatization about the gospel. That is to say, Christianity, the gospel, it's apolitical. I just don't even want to participate. I'm the neutral moderate who won't even encourage them by engaging. I'm not even going to fill out my ballot. Jesus for president, I'm going to write it in and send it in. And there's this kind of cynical distancing. I think that unfortunately, to say the gospel is apolitical is actually political, because you're always in a crucial historical moment in which you have to work to understand how the gospel translates into political life. So say Presbyterians in the 18th century in the South who are saying the gospel is apolitical, gospel doesn't speak to some of these questions, slavery is a key practice of the economy. You're saying something political by not being political or being activist or being abolitionist, right? So there's this sense of like we're always being required by history to try to do the work of translation in some sense.
I think there's a great pressure to private, especially maybe like a Christian worldview. I think seemingly our culture continues to try to divide maybe even like some of the wonderful things that have come from Christianity, but then try to divide it from its Christian roots. And I often think it's like anything like evangelism or any sort of dialogue of Christian faith in the
Mhm.
public sphere has
Yep.
become very taboo
Yep.
too.
Yeah, I mean that's the question I've been wrestling through is what does it mean to evangelize the public square or the political realm of our lives? Is that to like go out and literally vote Jesus for president or hand out the tract or bring people directly into the gospel?
Mhm.
Maybe that's part of it, certainly could be. Or is it that work of translation of like, hey, Christianity has a really profound view of human people as dignified and made in the image of
Mhm.
God. We think this form of universal health care or this form of treatment of people under the rule of
Yeah.
law, or it's that translation work of like, you don't need to buy into the theological premises, but you can see the goodness of the
Yeah.
policy or the law or the structure of the institution. I think that's always
Yeah.
the dance. And so here's why I think the polarization, the two-party system is so corrosive for the Christian church right now, is that the two-party polarization ploy is premised on a moral package deal. So there's moral package deals going on right now. So if you're for personal morality and the sanctity of unborn life and family values, you're over here and you know where you are. I don't even need to fill in the rest of that paragraph to know which side you're on. If you're for the social safety net and the care of the community, especially those who have been disempowered or most vulnerable in the town, the city, the neighborhood, the state, the country, and justice for them, you know which side you're on. Here's the problem. The gospel and the Christian view of human life and ethics is not neatly definable under those moral package deals. So one of my favorite Christian ethicists is actually, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyla, and he wrote, I mean, so much stuff on ethics, but his latest stuff was him defending and fighting for what he called a culture of life. A culture of life. That's what he called the gospel ethic. It's fundamentally, it's about sanctity of unborn life. It's about traditional marriage. It's about the family. It's also about economic practices that benefit the poor. It's different views about gun control and capital punishment. It's a view of war, just war, and pacifism. It's like all these things that don't fit together in our system. It's like you part of that works for Christians on this side, but not the rest of it. It's like, why are we defined in our imaginations by that kind of polarized package deal? And I think that part of it is just that we Christians aren't often educated or skilled or working at understanding the way in which the gospel translates into our moral and political life.
Yeah. So I was wondering if we can move towards this idea. Like, so the question is like, how is the gospel the answer? And like, how do we as a church, how do we respond to this? And like, even like practical, very specific takeaways for our specific church. Like, what are some of the things that you think we should be thinking about before we have our friends kind of
weigh in. They're gonna have stuff to weigh in. I can see them writing notes down on their pads and getting ready. I've been thinking about Jesus's interaction with the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well, the Gospel of John. That whole encounter in its socio-historical cultural context is so stunning. His disciples are like, why are you talking to this woman? And as the story just unravels, you see all the social, moral, political conventions that Jesus is undoing to have this conversation with this woman. He takes great interest in her and has this, ultimately spiritual encounter with her. And I think that that's just one of a zillion illustrations in Jesus's own life and interaction with people, is that he talks to strangers. And I think that that's probably the most important, both theological but political advice we could have right now, is talk to strangers, literal strangers who are foreign to you, or strangers to your own views or convictions and commitments. And I think that's one of the great breakdowns in my mind right now, Min, is that we have really strong, like narrow circles of community. So yourself, your family, maybe a few, usually not your neighborhood, a few of your friends, maybe people at church. And then you kind of skip all the other forms of community and friendship. And then there's like the nation out there, or the world, or the people you care about who have been treated unjustly. And there's like all these middle rings that are missing, these like concentric circles where you might encounter someone who challenges your views or thinks differently. And so, yeah, I think follow Jesus' example and talk to strangers. I don't know. What do you think? Answer your own question.
I mean, coming in close, I think is really important. Putting skin in the game and actually being accountable for like what we believe and testing those. I think that's a really important aspect of knowing whether or not what we actually believe. I think you earlier you talked about what if we're deceived, or what if we're actually not thinking rightly about things? How would we know? How are we? Because political blindness does happen.
Yeah,
we can believe in something so much that we'll try to change. We'll make the world look like what we believe in.
Yeah.
How do we prevent that? So I think one of the most important things is to, this is very personal for me. I think growing up, and I think this is historically true, Asian Americans are often not good voters. They just don't turn up to vote. And even in my own upbringing, I can be very personal. My mom never cared about that stuff and never asked me about like my civic duties and things like that. Just work hard, put your head down. That was kind of the mentality.
Yeah.
But in my 20s and 30s, I realized like, it's very selfish. It's very, very narrow to only worry about you and your kin and your close friends. To not think politically means you're not thinking about your neighbors, because there's many more people who don't fit into that circle.
Yeah.
And so I need to reach out. I need to go get close. And it's hard. Brene Brown talks about this a lot. It's hard to hate people up close, no matter what, even your political rival.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I would say is a good testament, or a good like test for how we navigate our convictions and our political convictions.
No, I think that's it. I grew up, Oregon, actually growing up here can be a kind of a political state in some ways. I mean, you think of, protests in Portland, wouldn't make you think that way, but there's a kind of pioneering spirit out here that feels so distant from DC or the halls of power that there's a kind of like politicallessness that is sort of like, yeah, that's for them to worry about, and we're here. And that, I think, to see that kind of apolitical spirit as potentially, kind of out of touch or selfish or self-indulgent in ways, to see that we have an obligation to history and to our community, and to, like you said, to see politics as being very local and being small. Certainly you got to fill out your ballot. Voting is a sacred right and act, but it also is fundamentally about being present to your own community and talking to strangers. So,
totally.
Yeah. Should we turn to the people?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's do it.
So for this portion, we'd love just discussion and just any questions, any thoughts, comments, things like that, for Dr. Claire.
No, for Min. Someone just has to be bold enough to kick us off. It's sometimes tough on Zoom, but please feel free.
I'll go.
Thanks, Daniel.
I think your question is interesting. Why are we defined by package deal politics? It's interesting because I do see in like our culture this sense of individualism, but when we come to the church, we have this otherworldly communion in which we're supposed to live and embody. And specifically, a sacramental church, they're a Eucharistic community. And as I was listening to you, there's this quote from John Chrysostom about the Eucharist and also our social ethics as well. He says, "You indeed honor this altar because it receives Christ's body. But those who themselves are the body of Christ, you treat with contempt and ignore as they die. You can see that altar everywhere, lying in the lanes and marketplaces, in every hour of the day. You can sacrifice upon it, for there too is sacrifice performed. So he brings the realization of the Eucharist as this like ontological identity for the church, that like I am because you are, and without you I'm not truly myself. And so the church is as this dramatic confrontation with culture, in terms of our identity, in terms of, while there is a sense of like individualness, we're not individual in and of ourselves.
Yes.
That's a good thought. Yeah.
That's a great thought.
Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. I think, just to stick with that for a second, say you're a sacramental liturgical church, which we are, you have this huge, huge menu of symbols that you perform corporately as individuals that have come together as a community, an I that is a we. And then the question is, how would you translate those symbolic actions out into the public square or sphere, right? So which parts of them do you take most determinative for that? So what would it mean to perform the confession of sin, which we do every week, on our knees together out on this grassy knoll? Like, are there analogies to that we could be performing publicly as we think about our shared or common life? I was just talking to a friend who's part of this thing called reconciliation pilgrimages, and they go around in the US to different sites in this country where there's been just tremendous just harm and violence and brokenness and prejudice and all the different things that are part of our history. And they go there to certainly feel the guilt and the shame and compunction that's part of confession, but they go there to pray and to learn and to think and to engage, and also to think about healing and think about reconciliation and think about justice and newness in the kingdom. So is that our main political sort of angle or lens that we would translate? Or is it something like a bit more cheery and positive than that? We take the go in peace to love and serve the Lord. We're out in the world and doing kingdom work in our secular vocation. So I think all that to say is, you're exactly right to say we have a vision of fragmented, broken individuals who come together and are made whole because of the work of Jesus Christ every Sunday. And we should be scratching our heads and probing our imaginations and hearts to be like, what would that mean out there in the world? How would we invite other people into the spirit of those practices, even if it's not explicitly theologically or liturgically, sort of worked out? So there's that sense from James K. Smith's of cultural liturgies, which he kind of says, in a negative sense, we're all part of these cultural liturgies out there that are shaping our affections in the stadium or the mall, and you got to see how that's shaping your heart and your loves. But then the question, you could flip it and say, what are our ecclesial liturgies as the body of Christ that you might want to take out into the culture, and maybe not even have them, be so theologically or Christianly laden, but people see it and they're like, oh, they were out doing a, garden share box thing, and going out to make sure healthy food was in the hands of those who weren't able to get it during this time of pandemic and economic crush. And we might have a theological kingdom imagination for what motivates us and animates us, but it doesn't need to be part of the explicit rationale or sort of explicit sort of description of the act that we're doing out in the world or something. Anyways, that's a great question. Thank you.
If I can weigh in,
Steve, please.
Yeah. First off, I think that the timing of this discussion not only obviously aligns with the political moment we're in, but I just really appreciate it, especially coming out of Father Sean's homily on Sunday, which was just so wise and so framing for me. I've been pretty anxious about this moment that's coming up November 3rd, as many of you are. And I found a real sense of peace personally, spiritually, following, just digesting and meditating on Father Sean's sermon. So if you haven't seen that or missed it, I really encourage people to go back to that teaching. But subsequently to that, I've been just thinking about how, and this connects to your points, Joseph, about just kind of the dangers of the two-party tribes, or three-party tribes, if you include Green or Libertarian. Maybe there's 3 or 4 party tribes, right? They're all tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as human beings, we're very attracted to tribes. We want a tribe. We want to belong to someone, but they're so increasingly hardened, right? They're just calcified, they're hardened. And I think it really causes great anxieties in all of us, and a hardening within us if we're not careful along the lines of those tribal political alliances. So I've been really challenged by his sermon, and also by the writing of a person I ran into just the day after Father Sean's sermon named David French. I don't know if anybody's heard of David French, but I recommend you looking at an essay that he wrote called The Spiritual Blessing of Political Homelessness, in which he argued in a way that echoed with Father Sean, which was basically against finding our tribal affiliation with politics, to recognize that those are transient and that our alliance with the kingdom is eternal, and to hold on very loosely to our political tribes, and to be willing to change our points of views, rather than hold on to them tight and clench and obsess about power and whether our tribe's winning or not. But again, not to opt out of the political moment, but to hold very loosely to it. So he calls that a spiritual blessing, to be politically homeless.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a really good word alongside of Father Sean's words over this last week.
May I say something? Are you done? Finished? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm curious in the sense of, it's insane. This whole thing's insane. I mean, I've never seen such absolute blaming. People don't think. I mean, it's worse than a circus. I don't even know how you could describe what's going on in this country, not just politically. And I think as a Christian, there's 2 things I think about. I've been dealing with my nephew and trying to explain some of the difference. First of all, it's how we see people. There's 2 ways of seeing people. You can think that with a little education or the right program or the right social circumstances, that we're basically good, and someday there's going to be world peace. Or you can look at people the way God does, that we've all come short. And that's very little of that in this country, or anywhere, quite frankly. Of people, first of all, instead of blaming everybody else, coming to understanding their own fault. And that is always the first thing that has to happen before when you come to God. Because if you can't see yourself the way you are and able to repent, and it's only because of the mercy and grace of God that we can do that, because we can know we're forgiven. I think there's people who probably, when we talk about depression, whatever, but for the most part, we live in a society that can keep you busy enough to not really have to reflect on things. The other thing is, I think that all of this is totally connected to how we live. I mean, I look at the news that I get on my phone, number 1, how biased it is, and 2, how trivial it is for the most part. And what is it that we are having that's more, that is a possible that what God gives us is so, what's the word I'm looking for? Substantial than what is out there. And it includes social media and everything. We have trapped ourselves into where we can't even work on our own cars. We're completely dependent upon electricity, on and on and on. We have appliances that are all electronic. We have gradually allowed ourselves to be boxed in. And not only boxed in by, then you have all your social media, Apple, and the rest of them. And so the point all I'm trying to make is that it's all insane. It always has been, but perhaps it seems more so now. When I look at the political situation when Christ was on the earth, and then also what the first first century church experienced. The racism in this country, of course there's racism everywhere. Whites aren't the only racist. And until we get to the point, the Germans in Russia, they were all killed by Stalin. So, let's just get to the point where there has always been people, dominating other people. One of the things that I get the most upset about in this world is when people have control over other people and are able to hurt them. I can't stand it. And yet we do it in so many different ways. And I understand, I just, we have what we have, but I can't say that either political party, both of them seem equally sick to me, but in different ways.
Yeah. And
so we try to vote, I suppose, and look at the different things that we can of sanctity of life. That's one. But the other thing is, when it comes to helping people and stuff, the world has run rings around the church as far as programs to help people.
Joan, this question of turning away from the world kind of leads me to a question that I had for Min and Joe along those same lines that Joan is marching down. In our baptism, we stand and we renounce the world, the flesh, and the devil. And so as we renounce these things, we take that into our life, engaging in the public square. You guys touched on this a bit. I can kind of think of a few ways in which you kind of gave us an imagination for entering in, such as Joe encountering Jesus, encountering the woman at the well, and embracing the other. How would you guys say we simultaneously live this life of renouncing the world, the flesh, and the devil, and yet we enter into civic life, social life, with a kind of generous, just a generous hope about what it means to be, we're still in the world. We're not of it, but we are distinctly in it. So how do we do that, do you guys think?
Yeah, that's so poignant. That's such a good question, and I think it's at the heart of it, Father Sean. And for me, as a Christ follower, I'm really interested in what it means to build political resiliency. What does it look like to, like, I don't know if you can do a thought exercise with me after November. When we know someone's going to win. What if it's not your guy? And what if other controversies come out of that, and our political system is being criticized, and just a lot of chaos. And to Joan's point, like, there's a lot that we can find hopelessness in.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in, like, both from a biblical perspective and from a historical church perspective. How did the church stay resilient, or how did individuals like Daniel or Joseph when he was in prison?
Yeah.
Or if you can imagine what Naaman might have felt like as an Assyrian general serving in a temple that he no longer believes is God. He's converted, but he retains his position and he tries to utilize his platform and things like that.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of instances where even when things go poorly, or when things go wrong, or where corruption is rampant, the Christ follower can find both hope because they're not in the world, or they're in the world, but they're not of the world. They're not dependent necessarily on these, what I think God would see as secondary authorities or secondary issues. That's kind of where I would start the conversation, but that's where I go. I'm interested in resiliency.
Yeah.
What does it look like to engage even in the midst of pain, even in the midst of corruption, even in the midst of losing, or actually feeling like the world is like falling apart? I think that's what I'm trying to, pursue in this season.
Yeah, and I think the resiliency has to come in the sense that we have a hope which transcends whatever earthly, political element or city we're a part of, into Father Sean's good message. I think for me, the answer to that question, Father Sean, is that we ought not think too neatly about the renunciation of the world, the flesh, and the devil, and imagine that we are not not just in the world, but that the world's not in you. The world is in you. And that, I think the church has had a grave sort of danger of a church world divide. So this is kind of politics and culture writ large, and this idea of the mundus, or the world. And the world, we're in the world, but the world's in us. And so the work of renunciation is the work of a lifetime. And that's okay. That should give us a kind of generosity of spirit and awareness of our fellow sort of citizens who maybe aren't Christians and are fallible and broken like us. But I think, Steve and Joan's comments, I think parallel nicely insofar as Christians have always kind of been on two axes in relationship to the political or the world, let's say, writ large. And Min was just talking to me about this. I think it's so insightful. And that is, if you're a Christian, you have to say humans are broken, are sinners, or whatever, pick your favorite sort of like metaphor to get in there that Joan's getting at. But people tend to emphasize different levels of severity or degrees of that brokenness when it comes to how we think of our shared political life. So human nature on one extreme is like broken to the point of we're just doomed, and we're just trying to restrain evil, vice, and sin as best we can. And so maybe that's through democracy, maybe it's through a king, I don't know. And then the other axis, so human nature, really, really fallen, totally depraved, can't get off the ground, can't get any common goods going.
Negative, positive.
Yeah. The other one is the world out there, the political, our common life, is malleable and ready to be transformed, ready to bring that imagination of the kingdom from the scriptures, from the liturgy, and it can be changed. Or those who are saying there's not a lot of change possible,
never
basically
change.
in it all. Yeah. So if you think about where you might fall in the quadrants there, you can hear kind of the answers. Even, David French's Political Homelessness has a kind of position there. And again, this isn't to like totalize every position and say you're just in this matrix, but it is to remind us that the church has had different responses to the political. In fact, I think history has required different responses at different times. So Bonhoeffer's resistance, to the Third Reich and the Barmen Declaration, it was a requirement of a no, to the political. It had a view of human nature, had a view of the limits of how the political could be transformed. Yeah. But every situation and historical circumstance seems to require a different response.
And if I can just add a footnote to that, I don't know if you agree with this, Joseph, but it's kind of like a paradoxical response to that. Like for me, I've been thinking about this. I feel very hopeful that I can make a small difference, whether it's through a vote, whether it's through engaging in community. Yeah. But what I need a dose of is urgency. And I think for my brothers and sisters who feel like it is just all just really going downhill really fast, I think often what we need to seek in the Lord is hope and rest and peace in that. And I think as we all engage in this individually and as a community, I think about those who are apolitical, or they're just not going to vote, or they're not going to really engage in November. They're just going to shut the door. I would say that might be a mistake. I think it might be actually fruitful for that individual to dive deeper in. And for those who are troubled and those who really believe that the next 4 years or the next 8 years or whatever is going to hinge on what happens this next month, I think we need a dosage of perspective in some ways. So I often think the remedy is not all encompassing, but we all deeply need those avenues for insight, for a bigger perspective, and ultimately to find both hope and urgency in those things.
Yeah.
I think too that we can be active. I think one of the things I would have liked to see in Oregon, for instance, is enough Christians who refuse to pay the tax money that pays for abortion. Because if enough people do refuse to do that, there's not much they can do about it. It's one activist thing. It just happens to be what I thought.
Yeah.
The other thing is, how do we get involved? I've been working because of my nephew and having some relationships with drug addicts or people trying to get out of it. And going back to some of these people have tremendous self-hatred, as well as, no sense of reality. But the idea that I've been doing is the fact that give God a chance. I mean, it's an amazing thing when you find out you can trust somebody. And it's not always easy, but you can trust God. And those kinds of things have been really exciting for me. To me, I think in a country like this is the best we can come up with, especially in the last election, but it's what we have.
Thanks, Joan.
We also could get involved. Some people, hopefully, I would love to see some good journalists today.
Yes.
People who are writing in depth and writing truth. It would be wonderful.
Thank you, Joan. Let's make time for one more question if someone hasn't had a chance to jump in. Anybody dying to get in? No. Radio silence. Well, that's good. I mean, Min, your comment just makes me think there's a temptation to the 4-year, ballot envelope weighing heavy on the kitchen counter, that it's like that's what politics is. It's kind of like going to church only at Christmas sort of feeling. And it's a denial of our lives being inherently political. And I do think the temptation to apoliticalness in the gospel right now, for those who have, they have the exilic, homeless kind of political feeling, which I think is totally fine and good. They're to think through the temptations of polarization or privatization in this moment, and to think about the burden, but also the kind of responsibility and obligation of being part of this country. I think in America in particular, you've got this really complex, beautiful, and broken relationship between Christianity and democracy in this country. That's a burden and an obligation of history. It can be a temptation to triumphalism or nostalgia, to a kind of like older day when Christians had more sway politically, but it also is a kind of cultural, theological responsibility to continue to think with our country, and to think together as a people, even as we become more pluralistic and secular and separate. So yeah, we're in a critical moment. And I think the main thing is to think through how Christ can instruct us. I think at the end of the day, there's actually a great amount of freedom that we have as Christians. There should be a kind of playfulness and hopefulness that comes through being discerning, free in the spirit, in able to think with our community, to think through the problems, obviously the brokenness and hopelessness that is being identified as real, but there's also a kind of comedy to this whole thing. I mean, that's my favorite lines in Chesterton's Orthodoxy, is that Christians fundamentally believe in the comic. We can laugh at ourselves because we're creatures. You don't have to take yourself ultimately important when you're a creature. But if you're not a creature, you got to take yourself really seriously if you're the author of your own destiny and everything that happens politically. So there's got to be
Can I just break in real quick? I'm sorry you're wrapping up, but
no, that's good.
I just wanted to make sure that people were clear that the author I mentioned, David French, does not argue at all for opting out of politics. And talking about being politically homeless, he's talking about holding on to political allegiances very lightly.
Right.
And recognizing our allegiances to the kingdom. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to give the misimpression that somehow I was advocating for putting forward a position that we're not constantly engaged in politics. And I think that's a great reminder, Joseph, to wrap this up, that politics is daily. It's not a 4-year exercise.
Everything's political.
Everything's political on a certain level.
Yeah.
And French gives very practical advice. He says, judge. He has a twofold measure. He says, judge the character of the candidate. Do they have the basic requisites character-wise to hold the office that they're aspiring toward? And are you generally in alignment with the political values that candidate is espousing? And he says if they fail those 2 tests, then you're voting for somebody else. So he gives a very practical kind of guideline, and he's a lawyer. He's definitely a person who argues for particular political perspectives, but he does it from an evangelical perspective. He's a conservative evangelical, so he's a very interesting person to weigh into this. And I just wanted to clarify.
No, that's super helpful, Steve. I think I certainly didn't mean to misrepresent that view. I think that's exactly right, is that there's a kind of exile that we have as Christians that helps us hold these things loosely, but it's not a political paralysis at the same time. Bill actually sent me something from this same guy, David French, this week that I've just dipped into, but just even examining our own etiquette in the realm of the political, especially as our political lives have become so digitized through social media and the internet, to think why we don't hold ourselves to the same standard of exchange and humanity digitally that we do face to face, or in our local communities. I think that there's something there about character and values that's just so essential. Anyhow, we should wrap, men. There's just so much good stuff. Thank you guys for hanging with us on this new experiment tonight, and it's been fun. I've learned a lot. Thank you, men.
Thank you, Dr. Claire.
Thank you guys for being with us. We'll wrap the formal part if you want to stick around and continue on. We're happy to do that. But God bless you all. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.